2, Side 1, Sam Phillips interview, 22388. We were just talking about some of your introductory knowledge to radar during the war and proximity fuses.
Yes. Well, I was talking about some of the influences on me that occurred during the war, many of which are related to technology and its application, although I wouldn't necessarily have categorized it that way at the time. The beginnings of guided missiles. There was a program in the Army Air Corps that went under the name, as I remember it, of Willie, which was to convert war-weary B-17s to being flown as drones. And those airplanes were equipped with radio control, these being relatively simple radio control transmitters and receivers hooked through servo mechanisms to the autopilots of that era. And the B-17, so converted, was loaded with, my memory says, 20,000 pounds of very, very high explosive. It was called Torpex, which was a very potent TNT explosive. The airplanes were fused in a variety of ways so that they would explode that big charge under impact. And there were other devices on the airplane to cause the explosion besides just impact fusing. The technique was for a pilot to take the airplane off and set it on course and to transfer control to the accompanying airplane, which was going to fly it by radio to its target. And the pilot would then jump out with a parachute, and the drone would be flown on to its target then by an accompanying director airplane.
This happened towards the end of the war or after the war, you're saying?
This was during World War II, and it was, I don't remember exactly when they were introduced, but my introduction to them was my squadron was assigned to escort more than one of these missions. We were, as P-38s, to escort one mission I remember in particular. We were to rendezvous with as I recall, it was a pair of drones with accompanying pair of directors, each controlling a drone. So there were 4 B-17s. And their mission was to fly at very low level, just off the surface of the North Sea. We rendezvoused with them somewhere around the coast of England, and their target were submarine pens on an island up in the, it was called Helgoland, and I'd have to look at a map to remind myself exactly where it was. But it was somewhere up in the Denmark, Norway, Sweden area, way up there I think in the Baltic. And the terminal guidance system on those drones was something I'd never even heard of at that time, or by then, was television. They had a television camera in the nose of the drone, transmitting its picture back to the director, and the director, for his terminal dive on the target, would keep the television image of his target right in that screen until he flew it right into the target. And I well remember, first of all, the length of that mission. It was more than 7 hours up there and back escorting these. But I also remember when they flew those drones in, their target was the entrance to this underground submarine pen installation, which was in some rocky area. And they flew those drones right into the doors of that pen, and there was just a tremendous explosion as a result. I never did see the post-attack reports, but it had to have accomplished its objective of devastating that submarine base.
That kind of attack and direct placement of explosives on a target would have been difficult with a typical bombing mission, I assume.
Virtually impossible. It would have been, I think, impossible to have penetrated into a submarine, an underground submarine installation without that in any other way that I knew of at that time. Well, that was my first direct exposure to guided missiles. Now, this, I think, probably history would say that these B-17 drones had their origins as a counter to the V-1. Now, by then, the V-1, the German buzz bomb, was being used, and my exposure to V-1s or buzz bombs were, I guess, in 2 or 3 different ways. One is that one of the tracks that those buzz bombs flew was over our base, and they had to have been launched from somewhere in Belgium or Holland to come over, because we were north of London, and in the main these buzz bombs were headed for London. And so on more than one occasion at night, we'd have an air raid siren, which was very unusual up until buzz bombs for our base to have an air raid alarm. And so we'd go outside and be near the bomb shelters that were underground. And you'd listen to these things, and if the engine ever quit, well, you wanted to get downstairs in that bomb shelter, because the way they worked was when the engine quit, it dived and exploded. So that was one exposure to those. Another exposure was on infrequent leave passes for a visit to London, with London being the target, and I was never close to where one hit, but there were a lot of them that hit in London. The way the missions were divided between the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Corps in those days, the Royal Air Force had the air defense mission, so their job was to do whatever airplanes could do to defend against V-1s. And I remember the RAF used their Hurricane fighter, and their defense against those was to fly formation with it, get alongside it and tip it, get a wing under it and tip it, which would spill its autopilot, and it would spin in and crash in the ocean. The option of shooting at it, was dangerous, because if it exploded, it would be dangerous to the fighter. Of course, they were also intercepted as they came across the coastline by the British anti-aircraft guns. But so now the targets. Well, the launching ramps that were being built in large numbers along the North Sea and Channel areas were very long launching rails, and it was apparent what they were once you got a good picture of them. And for reasons that are probably obvious, whenever there was a bombing mission set up against one of those launching areas, it was called a no-ball target. And I guess the reason is fairly obvious with this very long launching rail as the target. Now I think, well, at that period of the war, those launching ramps were fairly commonly set as targets for sizable bombing raids to try to suppress them. And I think, although I wasn't involved, but something I've picked up since, I believe that the origin of the B-17 drones was to attack those V-1 launch ramps. And then they were used for other purposes, like, for example, the submarine pen attack that I've described. Now, another exposure to early days of guided missiles was the German V-2. And my exposure to that, besides what limited publicity it received, were the intelligence reports that were available to us in our fighter squadron, plus infrequent visits to London when those unannounced explosions would do pretty considerable damage in populated areas. Of course, since I've learned an awful lot more about V-2s and its history. Now, another category of technology was observing, as we were escorting bombers, observing airplanes that virtually flew vertically. This was the ME-163, that number is somewhere close, which were the vertical piloted rockets that were sent, launched from the ground to fly up through a bomber formation and be able to make a firing attack as it went through on the way up, and then as its propulsion ran out and it was gliding down to be able to make another attack on the way down. I observed probably 2 or 3 events as we were escorting bombers where this was being used. So there's another sort of category of technology. Another one that was more directly that I was more directly involved in was the introduction of jet airplanes. The Germans the Luftwaffe had been virtually obliterated by a combination of U.S. and British attacks. So for some period, our missions of escorting bombers, our orders usually were to accompany the bombers to a certain point, and if there was not any fighter action for a significant part of our fighter force, then to be assigned to go down and attack ground targets. And so there was quite a long period of time in which the Luftwaffe was incapable. But, and I don't remember exactly, but it must have been in the spring or early part of 1945 when reports started to come up of again, German fighter attacks, and it was the introduction of the ME-262. And what the Luftwaffe had done was to identify sections of the Autobahn, generally down in the southern part of Germany, in Bavaria, and down toward Munich, and they'd carved out areas in the forest along the Autobahn where they built revetments and parking place for the airplanes, and they would use the Autobahn then to take off and to land. And the ME-262 was equipped with, I think, it was either 4 or 6 30-millimeter cannon, and they were located in the wings. And so it had a considerable firepower. And it also had a lot more speed than our airplanes. By then, my group had converted to P-51s from P-38s. So we were flying P-51s at that time. And so we were, as other fighter groups, were assigned when the ME-262s appeared, again to bomber escort, and particularly to try to deal with ME-262s. And fairly quickly after the appearance of the ME-262, our Air Force's counter was a fuel additive. And with the fuel that we'd been using was 100 octane, and I remember the maximum power settings, military power in the P-51 was 3,000 RPM and 65 inches of manifold pressure, and that I've forgotten exactly what it gave, but that's somewhere in the ballpark, I guess, of 2,000 horsepower on that engine. And at full military power, the P-51, I'd have to go back and check to get numbers, but at low altitude, the airspeed had to have been somewhere getting up around 300 miles an hour, but it was still well short of what the ME-262 could do. So with the fuel additive that was provided at our bases fairly quickly, we could go up to 85 inches of manifold pressure, and that increased the horsepower output of the engine by a lot. One of the penalties was that the engine had to be changed after each mission because it would virtually burn up the engine to run it very long at those high powers. But the speed difference was not so great. The P-51 chasing an ME-262 couldn't catch it. In other words, it was short of the 262 speed. But there were more than one ME-262 that was shot down by P-51s in that period. I don't know the statistics, but I guess I was impressed in retrospect with the speed with which fuel additives were provided. So, the knowledge of how to do that had to be there. And with the performance increase that provided, but it was still well short of the jet engine.
Well, did you feel confident as a pilot that you were going out there on nearly equal footing with these ME-262s, or did you feel it at a distinct disadvantage?
A distinct disadvantage in terms of speed, but and therefore the feeling of disadvantage was how how could you set yourself up to be able to catch the airplane. We had by then such an overwhelming numerical superiority that I think probably history would show that the 262 was, its effectiveness was a little more than an irritant at that period when it was introduced, because we had such overwhelming superiority. So, once they were identified and how they were operating was identified, then again, military mass could suppress them rather quickly. And for some period, they did some damage to bombers. They were able to make some missions where they did some damage. But here again, if they had introduced them significantly earlier, the technological advantage would have been very considerable. Now, their advantage, not only in propulsion, but in armament, with those 30-millimeter cannon. I saw an ME-262 at Bovington. It was right as the war was ending. I had the opportunity to go down to the Royal Air Force Test Base there at Bovington, by which time they'd captured an ME-262 intact. And I got to look it over. And it was impressive. Its armament as well as the engines, which, that's the point I'd never heard of. You couldn't quite conceive even how they would work.
Was there a sense of, with yourself and among your colleagues, that these various developments, the V1, the V2, the jet engines, were going to have a profound impact on military activity in the future?
Yes, very, very definitely. I guess the reason that I've mentioned the incidents and events that I was observed or was involved in was just for that very reason.
Yeah.
That
well, in retrospective, I mean, it's obvious they have an importance, but I wondered whether at the time they were as strongly felt as well.
To me, they were. It had a strong effect. The strong belief that had these developments occurred earlier, that the outcome of the war could have been substantially different, and that had considerable influence on my desire to be involved in the development side of activities. I'm not saying it very succinctly, but the point is that it was clear to me that for the United States to maintain a state of military preparedness, that we had to put a lot of emphasis on technological development to catch up with what we were seeing coming out in Germany as the war was drawing to an end. And of course, you'll recall that fairly rapidly after the World War II ended, the tensions with Russia were increasing pretty early and pretty rapidly, and the many events that were the beginnings of the tensions, the increasing tensions in the Cold War, made it apparent to me that for the United States to be able to maintain a military position vis-a-vis Russia, that we had to put a lot of stress on technology development. The general thought of the time, and to some extent I think it's still true, was the need for technological superiority to counter the numerical superiority that was available on the USSR side.
Well, you mentioned earlier that at the end of the war you received another assignment as a commissioned officer. You weren't allowed to go back to the United States, but were required to stay on in Europe. You were assigned to the theater headquarters, General Eisenhower staff. Were you involved to any extent in the effort to extract some of the knowledge that the Germans had acquired and as part of their scientific and technological effort in Fiat and some of these other enterprises that went on to draw some of this information out?
No, I was not. And if I had had the perception and the perspective that I had a little later, I would have worked hard to try to find an opportunity to be involved. But no, I was not involved. As a matter of fact, when I was assigned to the theater headquarters, I was assigned in G1, which is personnel in the Army system. Completely unrelated to any of my background, but I was assigned in G1. And that may have been because in that Army headquarters, the G1 section was headed by an Army Air Corps Major General. His name was Jim Bevins on Eisenhower's staff. And it may have been that I, as an Air Corps officer, was assigned to G1 because the boss was an Air Corps person. It certainly wasn't because of any other reason. It was later, much later, that I learned of the many efforts to learn, to acquire the German technology of that time. I wasn't even really aware of it in my period there in the Army of the Occupation.
And you were located where?
At Frankfurt. Yeah, the theater headquarters, United States Forces European Theater, that headquarters was in Frankfurt, Germany, and it had one of the staff sections was headed by General Clay, which was the beginnings of the military government portion of the theater headquarters. I was not directly involved in that, but that was part of the headquarters activity.
During the wartime, you progressed in rank up from first lieutenant through major towards the war's end. Did this result in increasing, I don't know what the proper word is, command responsibility, oversight of a larger number
Yes.
of junior officers and cadets?
Yes. I went through flying school as a second lieutenant. As a matter of fact, I was still a second lieutenant when I was in the beginnings, at least, of the 364th Fighter Group. I've forgotten when I got promoted to first lieutenant, but I was a second lieutenant quite a long time. As I got promoted to first lieutenant, to captain, and to major, I moved up in responsibility from just being a pilot, fighter pilot, to being a flight commander, which in our World War II squadrons, a flight would have a dozen or so pilots, and typically we would fly with a flight of 4 airplanes, but we'd have a dozen or so pilots that were assigned to that flight. And in the latter part of the war, I was a squadron commander, commanded the 384th Squadron, which would have 48 or 50 pilots, and a typical mission would fly 16 airplanes on as a squadron commander, the responsibilities embraced not only the pilots and the flying aspects, but also the supporting aspects of the squadron, engineering, communications, supply, and all of the support that has to occur. Up until you're in command of, at least in those years, up until I was in command of a squadron, all that other stuff was just taken for granted, the communications and the armaments and everything else, that just happened. But of course, the support organization that makes it possible for a squadron of 16 fighter airplanes to fly an effective mission requires a lot of management too.
That's what I was getting at, was when you began to gain some experience in this area.
Well, that was the latter part of World War II. Excuse me, I see.
Resuming after a brief pause.
A couple of other subjects that I think are of some significance that I think affected me during the war, that have to do, in some part at least, with the importance of decentralization or allowing initiative. After D-Day and the ground forces occupation progressively of continental Europe, although we in the 8th Air Force continued to have the long-range and strategic mission, including us fighter pilots. In other words, our mission was not generally the close ground support, which was a mission of the 9th Air Force. Nevertheless, as the ground armies advanced east across Europe, our squadrons were assigned alternate missions in the event that we would be required to move over to the continent. And the base that my squadron was assigned was a base that the ground army had just passed by, or had just captured near Kassel in Germany. And so very shortly after the army had advanced beyond Kassel, I took a couple of other pilots and we flew over there to look the place over, so we could make some plans for if we were ordered to move over there for whatever reason, we could do so effectively. And among the needs that we had was navigation aid. And our group communications officer, a major, I remember his name was Pook, P-O-O-K, was really a very innovative person, and as a result of a little conversation and seeing what the need was, he, with the small little technical group that he had there as communications people for the group, with their supporting maintenance shop, were able to convert a belly tank. It was a fairly large one. If I remember, the tanks on the P-51 were probably 2.5 or so feet in diameter and maybe 10 feet long, so they were fairly large. 250 gallon, I guess, comes to mind. So they did the work to split the tank and put on hinges and clasps and make it sufficiently strong and secure, and then to build into it the radio devices, including a collapsible directional antenna, which they could hang on the belly of a P-51. And so the job then was to get it over to this forward base, and to open it up and set it up, and with that then the directional antenna was able to provide in a rudimentary form the same kind of navigation aid we had on our own base there in England, a directional a DF system, which I don't know, the lesson to me there was how innovative a small group of competent people can be. When there's a need, they can very quickly satisfy that need by creating something which, in a system that would provide less opportunity for innovation. The sort of thing would never occur. And to a large degree, in a peacetime establishment with the structure of discipline that exists, you don't find as much of that in a normal peacetime environment. But that compels me also to mention related again to technology, the navigation aids that we had as fighter pilots in World War II were virtually non-existent. I mentioned earlier that our airplanes, both the P-38s and then the P-51s, were equipped only with these 4-channel VHF sets. They didn't have radio compasses or anything else. It was strictly those 4-channel VHF sets. And the weather in England on a large percentage of the occasions was pretty bad, and low clouds and low visibility were very common. And the way we would get back to our base, coming back from these very long raids over in Europe, was whenever we got within communication range to start calling for DF bearings from our own control tower. And with a short transmission and the directional antenna there on the ground, they would give us a steer, which was the heading to fly toward that base. And when the weather was really very bad, and it was fairly frequently, the technique for getting down was to, as you got closer to the base, which you could tell by the loudness of the signal for one thing, as well as your whatever dead reckoning you could do, was to call more frequently until you got a reverse bearing, which meant you'd passed the base. And you usually wanted to confirm that quickly. But remembering that much of that part of England, East Anglia, is relatively flat, the technique, once we got a reverse bearing, was to make some estimate of how far out you'd gone from the base, and usually to turn back and get a steer toward the base and then start down through the clouds. And it was not uncommon to break out with only a few feet to the ground and fairly poor visibility, and relying on those DF steers to guide you to the base. And the final navigation aid was start calling for flares. And so they had a mortar out in the middle of the field, and airmen or soldiers out there that would fire off these flares, and each base had its own color. I've forgotten what color ours had, but other bases had different colors because there were.
You knew whether you landed at the right base.
Yeah, but that believe me, was our navigation aid. Now, somewhere in the latter part of the war, low-frequency radio compasses came into being. We never got them. I think a lot of bombers had them. But another thing I just have to mention has to do with air traffic control. A typical raid out of England went on for months and months and months. Was 1,000 bombers escorted by 1,000 fighters. And those 1,000 bombers would be flying off of their number of bases around East Anglia and forming up their lines, usually above the clouds. And these 1,000 fighters were all taken off from our bases. And later in the day, we were all coming back, and when the weather was bad, we were all getting down through the clouds on our own. Now, the frequency of collision had to have been very, very low. I don't remember any of our airplanes being lost in our squadron or our group to collision during all this. I've wondered many times since about all of that. There was surely some intelligent planning done by the 8th Air Force in issuing all their orders every morning in terms of the general areas and tracks that these different squadrons would use. But still in all, I think about that little island, relatively, and 2,000 airplanes going up and down through those clouds, and the number of collisions being so small.
Conscious of, or do you recall desiring at the time some improved methods for getting up and down?
In a word, yes, but it was not born of fear. I don't recall having any sense of great apprehension and fear. And as a matter of fact, there really wasn't much else that was known or available. So, it wasn't that we didn't have something that was well known and available, and we just didn't have it. It just, in the main, my own awareness was that it didn't exist. Now, I mention all that for its own reasons, but for another reason. In the latter part of 1944, I began to, have some resurgence of technical interest, and started to, in the off-duty time from flying our missions, to try to do some inventing, if you will. The base that we were located on was called Honington. It had been a permanent RAF base before the war, before the U.S. Air Force took it over. And our squadron, our fighter group, was one of the main activities on the base and the only real flying activity. But also on that base was a fairly large depot, which Army Air Corps was a B-17 overhaul depot. And our group really had not much to do with it.
Let me just ask you to pause here at the end of this tape.
Okay.